And our featured keynote speaker tonight is Alissa L. I'm Eleanor Yick, Vice President of the League of Women Voters this year, and speaking to you tonight about our program. Next slide. The League of Women Voters, as many of you probably know, has been empowering and defending democracy for over 100 years. The League is a nonpartisan political organization for women and men, encouraging informed and active participation in government. The League never supports or opposes any political party or candidate. The League has two separate roles: voter service, public education, which is what we're doing tonight, and action and advocacy. Next slide. What's included in our voter service and education? Community program events like tonight, candidate forums, which are going on right now as we gear up for the primary in June. We also offer pros and cons on ballot measures. We do voter registration events, and we encourage people to contact or access votersedge.org, where they can find information about upcoming elections. Next slide. Tonight's webinar is scheduled to last just about an hour. We're hoping to leave time for Q&A at the end, but during the webinar, would you please keep yourself muted so that we don't hear background noises? And also, if you would like to enter a question for our speaker, please go to the bottom of your screen, click on the box that says chat, and another box will come up where you can type in your question and then hit return or post, and it will come into us. All of those questions will be viewed by our moderator after our speaker is finished, and she will select some questions to pose to the moderator and to the facilitator and the speaker, depending on how much time that we have available. So again, welcome to this program event. And I do want to acknowledge some League members just as we're getting ready to begin. Barbara Lee, who is chair of our Racial Justice Committee, and Ann Rabel, who is one of our League's vice presidents this year. Both of these League members have worked extensively on this program, and Ann is going to be our moderator tonight. And let's begin. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. I really appreciate it. And
Sure.
I am extremely happy to be able to introduce Alissa Shaw tonight on the issue of systemic racism in healthcare. This series of speakers on the issues of importance to the community through a racial justice lens came about because of the Racial Justice Committee. So we're very happy to present this really important speaker tonight. And it's hard to introduce Alissa because she has an incredibly impressive background that's so extensive that it's hard to mention everything she's done. So I will talk specifically about what she's done related to health issues. She initially had a post with the Peace Corps on the border of Nepal and India, which was ID'd at the time as a trafficking route of young girls and women. And she worked with the United Nations Office on Drug Crime in that position. And then when she returned to the United States, she worked at Planned Parenthood Mar Monte, which is located in San Jose, where she was responsible for political and health policy, and was then promoted to responsibility for legislative, policy, media, and electoral issues. And she worked on family planning funding and access to care for low-income Californians. She is now, and has been since 2014, I believe, a faculty member of the Public Health and Recreation Department at San Jose State University. She teaches through a lens of policy, politics, women's health, and access-centered equity. And as someone who has observed her teaching at San Jose State, she has very full classes of extremely diverse students, and what she presents to them is of great value to them in their education. So I will turn it over to Alissa.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, Anne. It's lovely to see you. And thank you very much to the League of Women Voters for having me join you this evening. And I know that I'm feeling also very humbled because I'm joining a very lofty group of individuals that have represented to you in the past. So it is an honor to be here and to talk about a bit about my journey as it relates to my own education around systemic racism. And so having said that, I'm going to begin and ensure that I can share my screen here. I'm assuming everybody can share my or see my screen. If you can't, please put that in the chat. Okay. So I'll just jump right in. And as Anne mentioned, my name is Alissa Shaw. I have had many different sort of roles in my career, and my most recent one is as an instructor at San Jose State, which is a majority minority school. And as a white woman, right, the vast majority of our faculty are not faculty of color. And yet we are teaching students of color. And so in my journey, as it relates to becoming far more versed in the issue of the structures of inequity and racism that we have in our country, with obviously the specific focus on health, but I'm going to be interspersing tonight's dialogue a bit with my own experience and my own journey as a privileged white woman, and I'll unpack some of those definitions, at least from my perspective. And so hopefully this will be an informative and interesting and ideally thought-provoking conversation. And let's begin here. So I have a couple questions for you before I start. So just wondering, you don't have to put it in the chat, just how often do you think about your race? Just think about that for a moment. And my next question is, how often do you think about your unearned privilege? And what do those words mean to you? All the time. As do I. Okay. So I pose those questions because I want to start this enormously broad conversation, right? Which, remember, people write books about the topic of systemic racism, holds really lengthy TED Talks, entire year-long curricula devoted to this issue. And so this is a really, really small component of the overall issue of systemic racism. And I'm focusing specifically on the issue of maternal mortality of Black women in this country. And the reason I'm focusing on that specifically is because when you look at the statistics for Black women, particularly around maternal mortality, one is faced with the reality of systemic racism in our country. And so let me begin here with just some definitions, right? And depending on whom you ask, the definitions would change. I am using the source down here cited at the bottom of this slide. And so the idea of unearned privilege, if that's not something that you've thought about, right? These are the privileges and the benefits that go along with things you didn't specifically earn, right? So the benefit of the doubt given to people based on their class, their race, their gender, or sexual orientation. Some examples of privilege are being accepted easily, being in a room with people of your same ethnicity regularly, right? Having really well-resourced schools, benefiting from a heteronormative society, meaning benefiting perhaps from being an individual who identifies as straight or cisgender. Being seen as a perfect example, getting let off from crimes, seeing the criminal justice system as a justice system and not a legal system, right? That is unjust. So these are this idea of unearned privilege. And so I just wanted to share that with you and a bit about my journey into this topic. It really didn't strike me, this idea of privilege, until I was in the Peace Corps and was the only white woman in a fairly large town in Nepal and could never go anywhere without being stared at. And it was a place of curiosity, the staring. But it gave me a real life lens into what it would be like to be the only person in the room of the same ethnicity that I identify with, but not with a lens of curiosity, but with a lens of distrust. Right? And so as I transitioned to working for Planned Parenthood and then now in the classroom in a majority minority school with students that avidly share their experiences of daily discrimination and racism, and who I am so grateful for sharing those stories, because that to me gives me the level of education to continuously be on this journey of understanding my unearned privilege and being an anti-racist, because that is a journey. And so we decide whether or not we're going to take that journey and push back on our internal biases and examine our unearned privilege, right? And continue that sometimes very uncomfortable, at least for me, journey. And then also manage our microaggressions, right? And so San Jose has given me that opportunity, which I'm incredibly grateful. More so than that, I'm grateful to my students for their candor. They have, and it's not their job as students of color, but they have educated me to the point that I am able and feel comfortable, right, as a white woman, examining my own privilege, but also being able to have this discussion with all of you, right? I am not an expert. This is not, as a white woman, right, I can examine my privilege and I can talk to you about that, but I am not a woman of color. So that is the onus on me as a woman who has benefited from a white structured society, right? It is my duty, in my opinion, to educate myself and to educate others and have these hard conversations about race and racism. So having said that, a little bit of unearned disadvantage, which is here on your screen now, right? The dominant US society as a whole discriminates against groups because of class, race, gender, sexual orientation. We're certainly seeing that across the nation right now as it relates to particularly youth and sexual orientation, particularly the transgender community. And these groups typically have less access, fewer supports, less respect, less credibility, and must continuously prove worthiness. Right? We saw this during Justice, and I love saying that word, Justice Jackson's Senate interrogation by Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz. And I know this isn't a political organization, but I think anyone could say that it was an interrogation. And so we saw how incredibly qualified she is to be a Supreme Court justice, and yet she had to prove herself again and again and again. And her white counterparts didn't go through that. So I think it's a really important time in history to be having these conversations, right? and not just because of this historic moment of Justice Jackson, but because we have a racial reckoning in this country right now. And we have the opportunity to learn from it and gain a new worldview by educating ourselves, right? Or, right, we can continue a dialogue of the fact that racism doesn't exist, right? This is a narrative that some people feel that our systems in this country are fine. There's no reason to teach critical race theory. I disagree. And so this idea of talking more about naming racism in our structures. We're not talking about individuals, we're talking about the structures, the institutions within our country, right? And so this is from our governing body as it relates to our work in public health. And this is the American Public Health Association, also known as the APHA. And Dr. Kamara Jones, who is a leader in a national dialogue around systemic racism through storytelling. And these are some of her definitions as it relates to race. And remembering, right, that race is not a biological construct, it's a social one. And it was deemed and put into place to separate people and to deem those who were powerful got to write the narrative, and those that had less power would remain with less power. And that includes less access to equity in schools, less access to equity, financial equity, certainly less access to healthcare and access to good healthcare. So these are some of the tenets that we'll be revisiting at the end of the lecture as well. Naming racism. I see this here in this structure, right? And then take it one step further, or I see it within someone that you know. Ask, how is racism operating here? Your institution, your community, right? And again, it doesn't need to be blatant. It can be micro in nature. And then organize and strategize to act, right? And that is the component, right, that I really appreciate the program that the League is doing, because having these tough conversations are tough and uncomfortable. And ideally, right, once we start that process, then organizing and being allies and strategizing to act are logical next steps. So this is a definition. I'm going to give you a few, right, of structural, and I'm using these terms synonymously, structural and systemic racism. A system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social determinant of how one looks. So, and that's race, right? And again, this is Dr. Kamara Jones. That's why this is put in quotes here. And so what does this do? What does systemic racism do? It unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. It unfairly disadvantages them, and then unfairly advantages some individuals and communities. But it saps the entire strength of this whole society through the waste of human resources. So let me unpack that a little bit more. So structural, institutionalized, systemic racism means different communities get different access to housing, good housing, housing with good air quality, right? Housing that has been maintained. So the lead paint, for example, is not readily available for little hands, right? Employment, equal access to employment. There have been studies that have been done around individuals that have, academic studies, that have posed their resumes to employers and have, quote unquote, had an African-American surname. And they were wholeheartedly rejected at an enormous rate because of that. same resume by a white sounding name, given, I'm sorry for the dog, given, Zoom, given, we're given interviews, right? And so that's just one study that illustrates, right? Systemic racism is deeply embedded in our employment system and income, right? So we know that women make 73 cents to the dollar than men do. Do you know what Black women make as it relates to white women? It's anywhere between 58% or 58 cents and 67 cents, regardless and irrespective of education level. So access to medical facilities, right? We'll talk about that in more detail as I bring the funnel down a little bit more narrow. And a clean environment, right? So this is the environmental justice and the environmental injustice statement around the fact that being able to access healthy environment, healthy air, healthy water, green space, all of that is environmental justice work. Right? So moving on from there, sort of the differential access to power is also information, including your own history, right? Remember who writes the textbooks, right? And having your history, particularly if you're a person of color, reflected back to you as important to be taught at a young age in middle school and high school and certainly in college, right? So I had, as a white woman, I had that narrated back to me in school, right? But did I learn about who Emmett Till was? No, it's not part of the curriculum, right? Did I learn who Henrietta Lacks was? No. Did I learn who Vincent Chin was? No. I learned the victories of the dominant white narrative, but I didn't learn the victories of, say, Dolores Huerta, Larry Itliong, who co-founded the United Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez. So my point is here, right, is that information, including one's history, also is a way to continue to structure racism in the education system. Resources, including wealth, health, organizational infrastructure, who gets promoted, who doesn't, who gets hired and who doesn't. And your voice, including voting rights, right? Access to the ability to exercise a constitutional protected right, and ensuring that you are not put the onus and a level of challenge is not unduly placed on you to cast that ballot and to make that vote. Control of the media, right? Control of that narrative, ensuring that the media reflects the diversity of the population, right? But you certainly see that when you think about those tenets, I hope what's coming to your mind of, wow, we do have some work to do. And we have ways to support young voices of color in particular, to tell their stories so that we can all learn from them. And ultimately, right, our society becomes more human when we are having these really tough discussions. Okay, so this is a visual that I'm sure some of you have seen before. So this is something I use in my classes very frequently. And so to the left, right, that's equality. Everyone has a stool or a box of the same height. Everyone gets that. But equality doesn't mean equity. Everyone gets the same thing in equality. But equity, right, you'll see that the little one there to the right gets 2 boxes because he can't see over the fence. He can't succeed and watch the game unless he has the 2 boxes to stand on. Right? But the one who's tall enough, he doesn't need the boxes, right? So he's gonna ensure that the boxes go to someone that needs them. And then ultimately, what's justice? Justice is there is no fence. there are no barriers. Everyone has access to watch the baseball game. So this is, I always try to present things from an equity standpoint. And knowing that, again, and I will sound like a broken record in the next 20 minutes around my privilege, right? And this is how I view the world. Like, I understand that I will be giving up some of my unearned privilege to ensure that we have a more equitable society. And these are the realities, right, of equity, which is why often it's a really scary concept for some, because it does potentially mean giving up some of that unearned privilege, i.e. that power, to ensure that somebody who has not had access to that gets access to it. Excuse me one moment. Sorry, I've been teaching all day long. All right, so having said that, I want to talk a bit too about bringing that funnel in a little bit closer, or a little bit more narrow. What does this mean for healthcare, specifically for women of color? That all of our systems, financial, educational, legal, health, they're all intertwined. So when we talk about healthcare, we can't really talk about systemic racism in healthcare, particularly because it's such a for-profit system, without talking about all of these other components, including our financial, education, and legal system. And so I really do want, I know this talk is about healthcare, but I want to address that first, because systemic racism is embedded and pervasive throughout all of our systems. And because they are so intertwined, right, it's very, very, very challenging to address the issue of systemic racism in healthcare when the people that are being educated to be in health are indeed in a systemically racist educational system. So what do we do about that? And these are the conversations that I love having with my students. So when we talk about healthcare for women of color, particularly for Black women, pervasive, systemic, lifelong racism, both macro, right, overt racism, and micro in nature. Like a professor who told one of my students today who shared in class, like, wow, you're really, really much smarter than you look. And right, and this is a woman of color. This is a woman who identifies as Black and who wears natural hair. And all she said to this class of 80 today was, I felt that big. And because you see the power structure too between a professor and a student, having your professor say something like that to you, right? This is pervasive. She said, that wasn't the first time I've had something like that said to me, but it's the first time here. It's our first semester at San Jose State. So, lack of representation, right? And cultural humility in healthcare settings. Another thing that I continuously learn from my students is the lack of representation in the healthcare setting of people that look like them, right? People that can speak their language, that they, for example, don't have to necessarily be the person that is translating for their parents, right? And having a truly culturally humble healthcare setting, but it doesn't mean that we will necessarily ever have the resources to have services in 15 different languages, but ensuring that we prioritize community health, and that means having access to translation services, and or just identifying, hey, this is a challenge, this is a need, and we're going to work on it, and we're going to work hard on it. And particularly for Black women, historical mistrust of the healthcare system, and we're going to dive into that here. So I'm going to show you a video here, and then we'll discuss it here in a moment. So bear with me, because sometimes it's a bit slow.
At the edge of Central Park in Manhattan, There's a bronze statue of a doctor named James Marion Sims, whose brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world. He's the guy who created the vaginal speculum, an instrument gynecologists use for examination. He pioneered the surgical repair for fistula, a complication from childbirth, and became known as the father of modern gynecology. But that brilliant achievement was the result of a series of excruciating experimental surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
That's Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author who chronicled the intersection of race and medicine in her book, Medical Apartheid. While many of the stark racial disparities in healthcare can be attributed to environmental and economic factors like access to good healthcare, studies show that minority patients tend to receive a lower quality of care than non-minorities, even when they have the same types of health insurance or the same ability to pay for care.
As African Americans, we've been abused for so long, consistently by the system. Why should we trust it? Why should we go to an ill? And that's eophobia. That's a fear of the healer, inculcated by the behavior of those healers, unfortunately.
It starts with slavery. Doctors relied on slave owners for financial stability. They accompanied plantation masters to auctions to verify the fitness of slaves and were called in to treat sick slaves to protect their owners' investments. In 1807, Congress abolished the importation of slaves and in turn pushed Black women to have more children, to essentially breed slaves. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson later wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm." Around the 1830s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, or efforts to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there were polygenists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolved from different origins. The 1830s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. One doctor performed experimental C-sections on slaves. Another one perfected the dangerous ovariotomy, or removal of an ovary by testing the procedure on slave women. In fact, half the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments on Black people. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves. His practices echoed one of the most prevalent and dangerous beliefs in medicine at the time, that Black people did not feel pain or anxiety. This book from 1851, titled The Natural History of Human Species, claimed the American dark races bear with indifference tortures insupportable to a white man. Studies released as recently as last year demonstrate that Black people are less likely to be treated for pain, particularly in the ER. There's even one from a children's hospital that found the same to be true for kids. And just this year, Pearson Education, a leading educational publisher, issued an apology and recalled nursing textbooks that included racist stereotypes, like this section that said Black people often report higher pain intensity than other cultures.
Well, what does it mean when you say that someone doesn't feel pain? Among other things, you're speaking about their humanity. These are all part of that suite of beliefs emanating from the 19th century that we still have not shaken up. despite all our knowledge and sophistication. They're deeply ingrained.
Doctors like Sims might fit the Dr. Frankenstein stereotype, but they weren't outliers. Historically, Southern doctors who used Black bodies for troubling experiments were the norm.
It's a very common question. How can we judge our forebears? You know, those guys in the 18th century who practiced medicine in a way that appalls us today. You know, we think, how could you do that? I did not judge the practitioners based on our own ethics. I judged them based on the ethics of their time. It was not acceptable back then. We just did not hear from the people who protested against it.
After the Civil War ended, the 1900s brought a wave of immigrants to the US. It sparked a race panic and coincided with the birth of the American eugenics movement. One of the movement's key objectives was to reduce the childbearing potential of the poor and disabled. Leaders included birth control pioneer and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who eventually devised the controversial Negro Project, or family planning centers that pushed birth control in the Black South. It was a project that even garnered support from W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, who wrote that Black people bred carelessly and disastrously. By the mid-1930s, more than half the states passed pro-sterilization laws, and often sterilization was forced. In 1961, future civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer went to the hospital to have a tumor removed, but was subjected to a hysterectomy without consent. The procedure, which rendered women infertile without their knowledge, was so common in the South that Hamer is said to have dubbed it the Mississippi appendectomy.
African-American babies were no longer economically valuable. And African-Americans themselves had gone from being a resource to a nuisance.
In June of 1973, the SPLC uncovered 100 to 150,000 cases of women who had been sterilized with federal funds in Alabama. Half the women were Black. In recent decades, women of color continue to be exposed to dubious reproductive health programs. In December 1990, the FDA approved a contraceptive called Norplant, and it was selectively marketed to Black teenagers in Baltimore schools.
Now, one of the current birth control methods now in the United States is Norplant.
Norplant fans like David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard, even introduced legislation to give women on welfare an annual reward of $100 if they agreed to get Norplant.
And it's time we start to encourage welfare mothers to be responsible.
That bill never passed, but the implant ignited a debate on whether long-term contraception, like Norplant that lasted 5 years, could be used as a form of social engineering when pushed to specific communities. Today, as we continue to lose Black mothers at alarming rates, a deeper look at the past may be a good step towards creating a more equitable healthcare system.
Okay, let me move forward here.
At the edge of Central Park in Manhattan.
So just a brief recap of what the video had mentioned, right? And the historic trauma that occurs for Black women, right? In conjunction with the daily racism encountered, right? And the specific health effects around that. And so these are some of the things that we'll talk a bit about. And I know that I only have about 15 more minutes, so I'm going to try to adhere to that as quickly as I can, giving this topic it's as much due diligence as we can. So as the video mentioned, Black women disproportionately shoulder the burden of maternal mortality in this country. And Black women are 4 to 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth than white women, regardless of income, education, or lifestyle. So if you put it another way, right, 243% more likely to die from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes than white women. So if that doesn't illustrate that we have a structural, institutional issue of racism, I don't know what does, right? And so this is depending on where you are in the country, more of a disproportionate burden and more of a health disparity. If you are in New York, this number, if you're in Brooklyn in particular, this number is 12 times higher than white women that die. And again, irregardless of income, education, or lifestyle, contrary to what many people feel. So this is the study that I was just referencing. And I'll talk more about this specific individual in a moment, but this analysis, and again, there are hyperlinks in this presentation, so you can do the research and read the papers and the study on your own. So this data found that Black college-educated mothers who gave birth in local hospitals were more likely to suffer from complications of pregnancy or childbirth than white women who had never graduated from high school. Right, so if we are looking at an argument potentially against the fact that we have racist systems, then this would be illustrative of the fact that we can take out diet, you can take out lifestyle, right? When you compare the facts and statistics of white women who've never graduated from high school and Black, highly educated Black women. So this is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. This for me is definitely a go-to source for information, particularly around health disparities. It is not affiliated with Kaiser Permanente. And so disparities amongst Black people. So you can see here, right, around preterm births, which is an indicator potentially of infant mortality, babies with low birth weight, same, pregnancy-related mortality, and then infant mortality, right? This is a child who dies before its first year of life. And you can see these figures in green and how disproportionately high it is for Black people in this country. So this is a specific instance of a highly, highly educated woman, dual PhD, and a recently minted lieutenant commander in the United States Public Health Service. So she died of a sudden cardiac arrest 3 weeks after giving birth and only 6 hours after having seen her physician. She had continuously gone to her care team saying, something's wrong. I know what I'm talking about. Not only do I know my body, but I know public health, right? I'm trained. I have headaches. I have really, really high blood pressure. Something's going on. And continuously, according to her family, she was dismissed with, you just had a baby, it's to be expected, right? Listen to us. And she's dead. And so this is a really tragic story, but unfortunately one that is not uncommon, right? Serena Williams, if many of you certainly know that name, right? So her birth story really rings true with Dr. Irving's. She was able to advocate for herself, but only continuously after having told her care team, I have a blood clot. I need you to assist me. And they kept dismissing her and kept dismissing her. And so she has opened up very, very publicly about her birth story and about how she feels that this is because we have a systemic healthcare system. And her care team felt that she was overreacting, that she could handle the pain, as we saw in the video. And this is a woman who's extremely well-resourced, world-renowned, known, right? Arguably the best athlete in the world. And this is how she was treated as a Black woman. So I'm keeping my eye on time here. I'll give myself 5 more minutes if that's okay. So why are these rates so high in the US? Right? Conditions like hypertension been linked to the stress of living in a racist society. Those microaggressions, those macroaggressions, right? And this has direct health outcome, particularly for pregnant women, right? Eclampsia, preeclampsia. And these are life-threatening emergencies, right? And then the detrimental health effects of daily life are further compounded by discrimination and disregard within medical institutions. So I really do want to talk about the idea of representation and how it matters, right? And so according to the Journal of General Internal Medicine, in 2018, about 13% of the US population was Black. Only 5.44% of physicians across the country were Black. And then studies have shown that Black women and infants who are cared for by Black physicians have better health outcomes. Right, so again, we're looking at a systemic issue. So why is it that we have an educational system that is only graduating 5.4% of all physicians across the country when we have a population of 13% that is not representative of the population itself, right? And this is, again, attributed to the consistent levels of structural racism. And again, I'm not giving this, if we had more time, I would be delving into a wonderful story called The Gardener's Tale. And that is by Kamara Jones. And I referenced her earlier in the presentation. And you can watch her TED Talk. It's called Allegories on Race and Racism. And The Gardener's Tale in particular spoke to me. And she has 4 different allegories about illustrating structural racism. So if we have more time, we do that. But I encourage you to go on YouTube, find that TED Talk, and really do that deep searching to see which allegory spoke the most to you. But if we had more time, we'd be doing that because she talks specifically about education in The Gardener's Tale and the structural inequities in education, which illustrates exactly, it's illustrated by these statistics here. So studies show that medical schools that have a focus on a culturally humble curriculum, right? That means having students address their biases, right? Really incorporating not just a class, incorporating it into the curriculum. Every class focuses on this, right? It's incorporated into the curriculum. And embraces diversity, embraces equity in practice. And that means equity and practice in staff and students. So it's my last slide here. Next steps. So back to the American Public Health Association, and again, the brilliant Dr. Jones. Name racism, talk about it. And ask how racism is operating here, whatever your here happens to be. And then organize and strategize to act. What does that mean for you as an individual? And so I put in the circle here, learn the history, learn the true history, right? Not the narrative necessarily we were told, but the true history. Talk about it. Right? And then maybe it means getting a little uncomfortable. And then having those conversations and having them in your family, right? My son and I, my 13-year-old, who actually is learning all about Emmett Till as a 7th grader. I'm so happy that the curriculum does have a critical race theory component in it, whether or not we want to call that here in California, but learning the true history, right? So this is where I will leave you. If you have questions, I will turn it over to Anne, and I thank you very much for your time. And
thank you,
have any
Alissa.
questions? Yeah.
Alissa, there's been a couple of questions. One of them is on that final statement about organizing and strategizing to act. And you said each of us, everybody should do that individually. But the question, do you have any ideas about what can be done and how to do something to organize and strategize to act as a group,
That's
to have
right.
input.
Okay. I have many. So I have many, and I think one thing as a group is to continue to have these opportunities for people to engage, right? And I think that is incredibly useful. And then ensuring, right, that there's follow-up, not just this, but there's a follow-up, right? What does that look like? Follow-up meaning continuously having conversations about structural inequity and structural racism. And because the more, at least for me in my personal experience, the more I continue to learn about this, the more it inhabits everything that I do. It inhabits what I read. It inhabits what I talk about. It inhabits my voting patterns. I ask specifically about critical race theory when I'm talking to people running for office, whether or not they have anything to do with it. But for me, when I explain what my definition of critical race theory is, like, will you talk about the history, not the narrative that we were told, not the white dominant history, true history. Will you talk about that? Right? Because ultimately, right, unless we have those narratives, unless we're calling racism out in all of our structures, right, we're going to continue in this way, and I'm not okay with that. So I guess, and to the group, I would say, like, the first deep dive would be you as an individual. And then from there, deciding as a group, what do you want to do? Do you want to make sure that, right, there is a fund set up for a student, for example, who's doing amazing advocacy work around addressing structural inequity? And do you want to ensure that there is a support system for that student? Again, voting. Can't talk about that more, right? Having conversations. That's what I so appreciated about 2020, is that we were having a national reckoning. But I would say that action is really up to the individual coming together as a group.
There's been another kind of group of questions or a couple related to the same issue, and everybody, including myself, I mean, the information about the doctor who was doing studies, yeah, unbelievable. But what I wonder is, based on what I'm being asked, is there's been a lot of data and a lot of things said about the fact that Black women have greater incidence of issues in childbirth. And I wonder, have there been any actual studies indicating why that is? Is there something that, I mean, I have no question that it's true that that's the case, and that, well, there's probably white women that have problems in childbirth, but not nearly as many.
We have a really high infant mortality and maternal mortality.
Right, exactly. But has there been any actual analysis of that it is from racist failure to provide care?
It's the failure to provide care, but it's also living in a systemically racist society, right? The stress of an overtly racist and micro-racist, microaggression society, right? And so the research suggests that this is absolutely the case, that, right, just like intergenerational trauma, it's generations and generations of stress, right? We know what it feels like to be in that fight or flight moment, right? But not all of us know what it means to be like living in that level of stress and what that does to your body, particularly for women. So in the PowerPoint, I did reference several different studies around specifically linking systemic racism and the daily discrimination, particularly Black women face. That illustrates, I think, that very well from an academic perspective.
Okay. There was a follow-up question about, does that issue of the daily stressors, which is absolutely acknowledged, part of the reason that apparently Black women also tend to age more quickly?
The life expectancy issue.
Yes.
So that, I haven't read that specifically around stress, because all of it, my lens is typically around reproductive health and
Mhm.
at that age. But I would hasten to guess that I could easily find research that would academically peer-reviewed research that would absolutely
Mhm.
say that that's the case, in conjunction with, right, the idea of the biases within the healthcare system, even if you are, right, well resourced. And so I would hasten to guess that would be quite easy to find. It just hasn't been my lane.
This has been really amazing. There aren't any other questions. Well, let me see. There might be one more. Oh, she says she meant aging more quickly, in that the question specifically is a 30-year-old Black woman's body may actually be older than a 30-year-old white woman's body. I don't know.
I don't know, to be honest,
Mhm.
right? I'm not a medical doctor, but I do know like how my own body relates, or my own body reacts to stress. And my stress is from a privileged white woman, educated white woman, right? And so again, I would say that that is most likely the case, but again, I can't speak with certainty on that because that's not my area.
Mhm.
I did get a direct message, if I may.
Oh, sure.
I did get a direct message, somebody asking, do you think that from the video, right, the experiments that were done on Black slaves, right, at that time, obviously they were slaves, and so they were the property of their white owners. Are you saying that this would not happen to a white woman? So this is the question that's being posed to me, and from a devil's advocate perspective. And so this is specifically from that perspective. No, because remember that white women were, while they were considered the property of their husbands at the time, they were not subjected to the level of callous and inhumane treatment that enslaved women were, because enslaved women were not considered human. White women, while being the property of their husbands, were considered human. So while I'm definitely not saying that white women do not experience, in this country, we have really high rates of maternal mortality, right? But the disproportionate burden is on Black women, as you saw from the charts and the research. And I'm definitely not saying this doesn't happen for white women. And we have an issue in this country as it relates to maternal mortality and infant mortality, but far, far higher for women of color and far higher than for Black women. Do we have an overall issue? Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I don't, oops, another one that, there's just a comment in the chat about supporting improved Medicare for all.
Absolutely.
Right. So I really appreciate it. I think we've gone a little bit beyond time and I didn't do my duty, but it was so interesting. So I really appreciate it, Alissa. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for
I think
having
it
me. This was wonderful, and I look forward to following other presentations, and I'll be there for the next one as you interview candidates. So very exciting.
Thank you. Thank you, Alissa, and also Barbara and Anne for organizing this very informative and upsetting and concerning conversation about systemic racism. Again, this is a culminating program to a series that the Racial Justice Committee sponsored this year, and I think it was a perfect culmination, if I can use that word perfect, in the sense that you were able to actually show many statistics and give many verified facts that kind of prove the issue that systemic racism is alive and well in so many of our institutions. And how do we begin to address that? And how do we really deal with it? Which is what we're grappling with. And I think future societies certainly are going to, future American societies are going to have to address. So thank you once again on behalf of the League and for giving your time to us tonight. And we're going to now conclude this part, but I do want to remind everybody who's listening, I can't forego the opportunity to remind you that California does have a primary election coming up on June 7th. Your mail-in ballots, which every registered voter in California should receive one, are going to be sent out starting the week of May 9th. So be watching the mail and be looking for it so that you can fill yours in and be an informed voter and participate. And I also want to point out on the next slide that we have, oh, it's a little bit out of order, but I'll try to. We do have some county-wide positions that the League has scheduled candidate forums on, and the first one on here is tomorrow night, April 28th. Our League is hosting a candidate forum for the District Attorney of Santa Clara County. On May 3rd, the Palo Alto League is hosting one for Congressional District 16. On May 5th, the Los Altos Mountain View League is hosting one for the Santa Clara County Assessor. And then our League, again, is hosting a candidate forum for the newly configured Assembly District 28, which Los Gatos and Montecito are a part of. So we hope that you will attempt to attend these candidate forums. You can see at the top of that slide, you can go into the League of Women Voters of Santa Clara County or Santa Clara County League of Women Voters website, and you can find the listing of all these candidate forums and you can register for them. So again, thank you very much for coming tonight. We hope you learned something from the program and took something away from it that will be helpful to you. And we look forward to your attending our future events. Thank you and good night.